Women's Studies at Hofstra University. We are the co-sponsor, co-host, Elaine, what do I call us? Co-host of the third in a series of conversations about race. When my parents moved out here in 1955 to Valley Stream, everything was new. The houses were new. The sod rolled out on the lawns was new. Those spindly trees with the earth balls and burlap were new. The streets were new. You could eat off the streets. Even the sewers underneath the streets were new. The other thing that was common is that everything was white. My neighborhood, there was not a single person of color anywhere. Not in the schools, not even in the village government. And over the years, in my life as a journalist and now as an academic, we watched Long Island segregate more deeply and more profoundly in many, many ways, to the point where a few years ago, I can't imagine having a conversation like this, much less get hundreds and hundreds of people leave motivated to do something, anything about it. Well, considering the 300 people who showed up at Stony Brook a couple of nights ago in Riverhead, over 100 people here, I don't know, 150, 160, I'm getting a nod on that. All sellouts, all standing room only. It gives me just a glimmer of hope that we have a chance to change, if not for my old fogey generation, at least for the next and the one after that. So thank you all for coming. I'm honored and privileged to be partnering with Elaine, and I hope that you get as much out of this as I expect that you will. Thank you. Elaine?
So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Larry. We do appreciate your partnership, you and your staff, Ina, helping us out here. And I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for sharing your evening with us. And I wanted to just say a few words about Erase Racism. I'm the founder and the president, Elaine Gross. We've been around since 2001. And our focus has always been to identify and address institutional and structural racism, especially in the areas of public school education and also housing. And we've done this using research and policy analysis and advocacy, as well as educating the public and trying to engage the public in ways to bring about greater racial equity. So we are pleased to have this new initiative where we ask the question, how do we build a just Long Island? We wouldn't have been able to do it without substantial funding from the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rock. So we're very grateful for that. We also have some additional funding from the Roush Foundation that is helping with our communications. And you may have a sense about what a good job they've been doing. I don't know if you've seen the Newsday article and the Brian Lair show on WNYC, etc. And we are very grateful for, and I say we because we should be grateful also, we're very grateful for the staff of Erase Racism, because without the staff, we would not have these forums. Kelly Abernethy is a part-time person coordinating all of these forums. A number of you I know have been emailing her or talking to her on the phone. Naya Berg is our education equity organizer, and she is a full-time staffer, and she's been our in-house tech person as well. Shirley Sharon-Fox, you probably met out front. She is the controller and operations manager for Erase Racism. And then we have some part-time staffers, Olivia Ildefonso and John Mulvey, who have also helped, along with some interns. So I think I have included all the people that I need to thank right now, in addition to the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University. Would you join me, please, in recognizing them? Now I see that some of you have gotten onto the poll. Are there some people that have been trying to get on and had some difficulty or anything like that? Are there some people that don't have a phone that can do this? Because we also have some papers that we can hand out to you. If you raise their hand, the volunteers will bring around some of those papers. Okay, so we need some. Where are the volunteers with the sheets?
We'll bring them.
There's, in the back, please. In the back of the room. So while we are trying to get some more people onto the polling, people have been able to do the text, huh?
Yes.
Paper. Jim? Let me ask another question. Let's give a sense of who's in the room. As Larry was alluding to, it's not all white anymore. We seem to have quite a bit of diversity here. Could you please answer these questions, these census questions? Let's see who's in the room here.
Are you A, B, C, D, or white? Where are you? G. I am D.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to give you another one. How about gender? Who's here? So we've consistently had more women than men. So the men, you're going to have to do better. Be sure to tell some of your friends and colleagues so that at our next forum, by the way, the next forum that has seats available is Monday, December 10th in Hop Hop. So you can, of course, online, you can register, but see staff if you have any questions about that. And then one more question for our live poll. Where do you live?
I have no idea. Where do I live?
Okay, there we go. So where is the furthest away that someone has come?
Bayport.
So I see Bayside and Queens.
Philadelphia.
Wonderful. So we have people from a lot of different places here, and that's also something that's happened with the other two forums. People are traveling to get to one of these forums. I think they're coming when a date is convenient to them, and they're traveling. That's great. So I'm going to leave that up in case a few more people want to log in. So tonight is the third of 5 forums, and we were in Stony Brook first, we were in Riverhead last night. Tomorrow morning we're going to be in Melville. and then we will be in Hauppauge on Monday. And we're launching this initiative with these face-to-face forums because we thought it was important for people like you to be engaged in this conversation. This was not just something for the staff and board at Erase Racism to talk about. And we knew that it would be a challenging conversation, talking about addressing structural racism. We knew that Long Island is a place with a history, and it's not such a pleasant history, but we also thought that there were a lot of people at this moment who wanted to do something positive to make a change. And I think that our assumptions seem to be proving right, just based on the participation in the 3 forums. One very important action, which we feel everybody needs to do, is to educate ourselves. And I thank those of you who completed the surveys ahead of time, because that's also partly what you said. You'll find that we are addressing a lot of the things that you talked about in the surveys, but also there are some things we won't get to now, but we'll get to in the future. So stick with us, please. I'm going to just take a few minutes to show a few slides to set the context for our discussion. And then we have a wonderful panel which I will invite up. So to set the context, let's just talk about Long Island. And this map of Long Island showing the 125 school districts, you'll just see from the colors that we don't have all the colors, even though you can't see all the detail on this. You can see that we have a tremendous amount of racial segregation here. And Long Island, in fact, is among the 10 most racially segregated metropolitan regions in the country. Here's one more snapshot of Long Island. And what you'll pick up here is that not only are we segregated, but we're very fragmented in ways that make solving our problems a little more difficult. So we have, in addition to the 125 school districts, you see we have several towns and we have 665 government entities. And if we had on there the taxing jurisdictions, we would have, up in the thousands. So tremendous fragmentation with a lot of people. 2.8 isn't a tiny population. And then this is a snapshot for the 2 counties, our racial demographics. And I think that let's just see how we were in the room. I think we had something like 75% white, 13% black, 7% Hispanic, Latinx, and 5, I didn't get all of them down. Writing quickly. So we did manage to have some diversity that's not that far off from what we actually have here on Long Island. That's a good thing. So the bad thing, though, is that even though we do have greater diversity on Long Island than we used to, and I showed you the school districts to start, we did some research between the end of 2004 and the end of 2016 just to see what was happening with our school districts. And what we saw is that we nearly tripled the number of students in the minority districts that are intensely segregated, meaning 90 to 100% non-white in that period. And if we're just looking at the districts, we started with 5 intensely segregated districts, and we ended with 11, so more than doubled. And that's just one statistic. We don't have time. We could do this for a variety of areas and issues. But if we're going to have a conversation about structural racism, we all need to kind of be on the same page with reality. So that's why we want to just have a little snapshot. Now, I'm going to invite our panelists to join me, please, up here. One more down. Oh, does she need to be there?
You are blocking the shot. Is there any way you can move the chair down there? Okay. Okay. Just try moving over here.
Okay, we just have to swap out.
All right.
Okay. So our first panelist tonight is Dr. Jonathan Lightfoot, who's Associate Professor, Teaching, Learning, and Technology, Hofstra University. Jonathan is also the inaugural director of the Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice at Hofstra University. He received his PhD in Policy Studies from the University of Illinois at Chicago, master's degree from Harvard University's Graduate School of Education, and bachelor's degree in Economics from Cornell University. His research agenda focuses on anti-racist, anti-oppression education and schooling, education for social justice, school desegregation, and critical review of legal and public policy. He is a contributor to the Encyclopedia of Social and Cultural Foundations in Education and the International Journal of Education Administration. He is a member of the editorial advisory board of the Journal of Research and Leadership Education. And Dr. Lightfoot represented Hofstra School of Education on the University Senate for 6 years and chaired the Graduate Academic Affairs Committee. Work outside of the academy include conducting training workshops for K-12 teachers, staff, and students on identity construction, cross-cultural communication, and implicit bias. Dr. Jonathan Lightfoot is going to speak about scientific racism. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Hi, everyone. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about scientific racism. I can't do it in 8 minutes, but I'm going to try. There's a lot to say about that. So I'm a foundations professor, so my area of expertise in education is foundational education. And what that is a way of adopting a multi-perspective analysis of issues and problem solving. So I take 4 areas of inquiry and come away with an understanding of how we could best address and approach a problem, particularly in education. But I think it's applicable in a number of areas when it comes to problem solving. So first of all, we look at okay, use the mic.
Yeah.
All right, so when we start over?
No, we got it.
Yeah. Okay, so as a foundations person, I use 4 particular areas of inquiry to understand problem solving and to approach issues, whether it be in education or other areas. So the first area that I use to establish a foundational approach is the history. So I try to put things in historical context. And once I've established a historical context, I move on to philosophy. I try to put things in philosophical context. And then we go on to sociology, and we put things in sociological context. And lastly, I make an attempt to use politics as a frame of reference. I put things in political context. And sometimes we say political/legal, because you find many politicians are lawyers, and they like to codify things and put things in legalese and so forth. But with that said, when I look at things in historical context, so with this particular area, scientific racism, and trying to make a critical connection between scientific racism and structural racism as we experience it today in America, I like to start off thinking of America at its genesis, at its start, from westward expansion from Europe, the transatlantic slave trade. I say the beginning of America was like a marriage. It was an unholy alliance between racism and capitalism. And it's founded on the genocide of indigenous people who were here, and the enslavement of African people who were brought here. So it's that union I try to frame and understand and look and use as a lens to try to understand what the vestiges of that historical precedent means for us today. All right, so then as a philosophical lens, philosophy is like this way of kind of thinking about things. How are you going to think about something? And you know, you can use all the fancy terms of metaphysics and epistemology and axiology, which is just trying to understand, for instance, how you use your five senses to experiment and understand things. So, you know, how you see things, observation, you know, how you're feeling about something, to be able to, you know, use the tangible nature or you know, being able to take those senses and make sense of it, of what the phenomena is you're trying to understand. And with philosophy, I try to break it up into two parts. So someone asks you to analyze something. So you're going to analyze something. What they're asking you to do is just trying to figure out what is, you know, what appears to be, what seems to be. You're trying to answer that question when you analyze something. But I think primarily our educational school system is pretty much built on this whole analytical thing and neglect. I think the other big aspect of philosophy, or putting things in philosophical context, is to look at the prophetic. And the prophetic asks a different question. And it asks the question of what should be, what's possible. So a great example I like to use is that if someone asks me to analyze the situation around the world, whether or not we're getting along or not, we said, no, I don't think we're getting along at all. I think we're at war. We have rumors of wars. We're threatening each other and so forth. We're not getting along. So your analysis comes to that conclusion that yes, there's war, and you know, war is you know, something that we've come to accept. Whereas a prophetic assessment of this situation would say, if war is our reality, then peace is possible. Yeah, right. So think about that. And then when we think about you know, what our values are, what our ways of knowing are, and so forth, and how it has that stem and branching off from that Greek understanding. You know, you look at these Greek philosophers, and I'll touch upon that at times, just the Aristotelian view of that, which is where Aristotle, they say he might be the father of scientific racism. You know, we might think about that. And those who came after him were kind of building on his ideas in large part. And sociology, we look at and say, well, you know, what's the motivation for human behavior in social settings? You know, how do we come together and treat one another and regard one another and so forth? And so, and we're going to think that what all those guiding principles and values and morals and ethics and so forth that, you know, we tease out of philosophy to say, hey, maybe that informs how we treat each other, and so forth, sociologically speaking. And politically, I just think about one word, power. You know, we're thinking about power. Who has it? Who's trying to get it? You know, who's in whatever games and tricks of negotiation you're using to try to, you know, hold on to it. You know, so and we look at it as a spectrum. We look at liberals and conservatives and radicals and so forth, and where you fall on the spectrum, center right, center left, and so forth, and what that says. And ultimately, a conservative at its core is, as its name suggests, is trying to maintain the status quo. And it also has this fundamental belief that, as far as America is concerned, we believe that so-called free market capitalism is the best form of economic organization for the society. Okay, so all that entails, all the competition, all the meritocracy, all of the high stakes testing, all the Darwinism, survival of the fittest, all of the stuff that creates all kind of angst for a lot of people, particularly the have-nots and the oppressed. And the liberals fundamentally agree with the conservatives. There's really not much difference. The only thing is that they're like Miller and Miller Lite. That's what I would basically, that's what it comes down to. They like capitalism too, but they say, with some oversight, with some regulation, but let's be a bit compassionate with our, capitalism. So, compassionate capitalism. Is that oxymoron? So looking at that, so let's look at what, before my minutes run out. So what is scientific racism? I put on the reading glasses here. So here's the belief that empirical evidence exists and the use of such empirical data to prove, and I use quotes around prove, support or justify racism, and more specifically, as understood through a Western American and Eurocentric perspective, black racial inferiority and white racial superiority. In fact, the nomenclature is faulty and should be more aptly called pseudoscientific racism because it is bad. It's bad science, it's bogus, it's a sham, it's deceptive, so forth. These ideas of white supremacy once enjoyed broad credence and acceptance in the scientific community from the 18th to the mid-20th centuries. We're talking about 1950s, 60s. Okay, so our lifetime, at least mine. That it enjoyed broad acceptance. So it became politically incorrect to publicly espouse such ideology beginning around the time of the post-McCarthy era and the emergence of the modern American civil rights movement under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King in the 1950s America. The passage of various civil rights legislation and Supreme Court decisions effectively sent this kind of thinking and associated behavior underground and in the closet. However, there are prickly signs that the ideas of pseudoscientific racism is once again rearing its ugly head and coming out of the proverbial closet. Certain scientific journals are publishing the work of science scholars who dare to revisit notions of racial difference and racial hierarchy. Politicians readily appropriate the faulty logic of racialized meritocracy to win elections, and it's working. Therefore, I must argue that pseudoscientific racism never really left. It just went on sabbatical to retool and reframe its approach to promoting division and dissension among people. So I just want to define a few terms, and I'm going to run right quick through them. I want you to read the AAA Statement on Race, the American Anthropological Association Statement on Race. It is informative, and it came out about 20 years ago, 1998 May, and when you see that date, you know you're at the right one. Okay, and its basic premise is that race is a social construct, bottom line. But it's only a 2.5-page document. Read it, I suggest it. Eugenics, related to scientific racism. So this is this idea about engineering genes so that we can, come up with, a better society. So we can prevent the poor, the slow, the lame, and so forth from procreating. Then we should come up with a better society. So these scientific races did all kinds of things like measuring cranial skulls. They would collect skulls from all over the world, and they decided they were big on taxonomy and classification and categorization and trying to associate inferior blood and behavior and learning capacity, all that's with it. A couple of things when it came to medical experimentation. This is what it involved. into medical experimentation. So the so-called father of gynecology, you may have heard of this guy, James Meriden Sims, that just took his statue down in Manhattan. You know, they had this idea that black people did not feel pain. They had a different level of a threshold of feeling pain. So they would take these enslaved black women and do surgery on them without anesthesia. Yeah, and even today, I look at that, I show my students this, that medical students, they surveyed and studied medical students. They too also believe that black people have a different threshold of pain and thicker skin and so forth. So I'm going to leave this alone, and I really would like to just leave you with a couple of things. This whole idea of you know, structural impact. I can name all these people, you know, who really contributed, you know, to this problem, and how the vestiges of it still haunt us today and so forth. But, you know, as we come up and we value this whole scientific method and believe that science, you know, should be what we should put our faith and trust in and so forth, and understanding, you know, that three things I'll leave you with. The whole idea about race as a social construct and is scientifically baseless. It's incoherent, it's illogical. There is no DNA test to prove or tell you what race you are. It does not exist. And so, whole idea about race is myth. But racism is real. And that's what the anthropologists seem to have a problem with, making that leap from doing a good job to deconstruct the whole idea about, you know, the scientific basisness of race, but then they have a problem with the racism that results from all of the, you know, problems that they create, anthropologists, to you know, have us thinking that this is something that's real that we need to pay attention to. And lastly, that you know, race is primarily a colonial invention. It was invented in colonial spaces to create this hierarchy, to make us believe that you know, there is difference, and that difference is deficient, and that's what we need to you know, focus on to maintain at the end of the day, you know, racial superiority. You know, this, and I use race like this. So as the director of the Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice, whenever you see our name, those who want to know why we put quotes around race, you know, because what? Not really.
Thank you, Jonathan. Our next speaker is Joye Brown, columnist at Newsday since 2006, when she won the Long Island Press Club Columnist Award. She joined the newspaper in 1983 and has worked as a reporter, an editor, newsroom administrator, and editorial writer. Sorry about that. She has been a part of several award-winning efforts, including the 1984 Pulitzer Prize Local Reporting Team. In 2000, she won awards from the Deadline Club. Is that a typo? Is that right? Deadline Club, okay. The National Headliner Awards, the New York Newspaper Publishers Association, and the Society for Silurians for editorial writing. Before coming to Newsday, Brown was a reporter for the News and Observer of Raleigh, North Carolina, and the Chicago Tribune. Brown, a native of Washington, D.C., has a degree in journalism from George Washington University. Please help me welcome Joye Brown.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I am very, very low tech. Wasn't this week longer before? Don't start me yet. Oh, okay. That's unfair. First off, I think there's some value in kind of knowing who's in the room a little bit. I came to Newsday 36 years ago as a minority affairs reporter, and I think that I have met many of you in this newsroom, or newsroom, over that period of time. Just for a second, Can those who have been involved in the fight for equity on Long Island raise your hand? Because I've talked to you over for, just raise them up. Now take a look around the room. These folks have been doing this for a very, very, very long time, and I just thought that we should recognize that. Now you can start. I was asked to take a look at history, and God knows I could start back with the Indians back in the Paleolithic times who came to Long Island, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the Minority Affairs reporter at Newsday, new to Long Island. What I did was I went back through a file drawer and pulled up some stuff just to sort of get an idea of what was it that attracted me? What was it that I was writing about? How come I know so many of you over the decades in this room fighting for racial equity? And in that, I hope that you learn a little bit about the history of Long Island, and you learn a little bit about, when we talk about institutions and structures, what it means. I was at the paper for about 10 minutes when I worked with a colleague of mine on a story. How many of you have been to Ducks Stadium to see the Ducks play? How many of you have been out there? Right? Courthouse, the whole kit and caboodle. When I go out there, I see something totally different. I see a series that Bob Fresco and I wrote back in 1984. It's called Legacy of a Slumlord. Legacy of a Slumlord. You don't know what was there before. I do. I was there. I talked to people there. And I thought you might find this interesting. I talked to a woman, Claritha. She told me that she put her kids to bed with cotton in their ears so that cockroaches wouldn't come in, because she had a visitor and cockroaches went into visitors' ears. She told me that she's been trying to make a home for her family. I'll read this. Despite the rats, bad plumbing and sponging floors. In her 4-bedroom house, the front door leads to one side and can't be locked. Her bathroom sink drains into a bucket as she must use pliers to turn on the shower. There's a hole in many of those homes out there. There was a hole in the middle of the dining room floor. A hole. I don't know why, but there was a hole. Back then, I talked to Lee Koppelman. Does anybody know who he is? All right, Lee's been around for a long time. Executive Director of the Long Island Regional Planning Board. He said housing for poor people, and poor, by the way, doesn't just mean poor people. We understand that, yes? Would continue to deteriorate as long as communities block efforts to build low and moderate income housing. He said the situation was particularly bleak for blacks and Hispanics, groups that make up the bulk of the Northrop tenants. The biggest slumlord was a guy by the name of James Northrop. He was the guy who owned all of these homes, not just in Central Islip, but in other communities. Quote, you attack a guy like Northrop, but we haven't provided housing for those on limited incomes, he said. It hasn't been perceived as good politics because the people who come here from New York City don't want anything to do with poor people. 1984, I've been at Newsday for a year. Me and Bob Fresco. Told you I was low tech. We're gonna bring it up to 1987. And Larry Levy actually worked with me on this one. How many of you have been to Long Beach? Isn't it beautiful? Okay, let me tell you what I see. In an effort to revive a dying city, this is 1987, Long Beach officials drove out thousands of the poor, the elderly, and ex-mental patients, many of them blacks and Hispanics whose lives were rooted in the community. At almost every turn, officials used and sometimes abused a powerful legal arsenal to not only force out the needy, but to block virtually every public and private effort to help them stay. With astonishing speed, the city displaced at least 3,000 people, about 10% of Long Island's population, by targeting adult homes and old apartments for demolition to make way for giant co-ops and glittering condominiums. Sometimes, council members and political leaders say they drove around the city at night picking out buildings for destruction. The city ripped down buildings that didn't have to be, said Charles Theophan. He was then the city manager. He said, my feeling was that they were trying not to just discourage the poor, but to drive them out. Now, I started out as a reporter on the story and ended up as an editor. But when I was a reporter, I found in a drawer in the public library a plan from 1977. And this was an official city document. And it said that their policy would be to drive out, quote, dependent populations and replace them with more affluent families. That is 1987. My kid's gonna be 30 years old next year. It was 32 years ago that I was the editor on this little project over here. Segregation on Long Island. We did polling. We did everything we possibly could to try as best we could back in whatever year that was, 30 years ago, 1988, 87 I think it was, to sort of get a grip on what it was that we were doing on Long Island. What does segregation mean? What was the impact on parents who wanted to send their kids to school? One funny thing about this, one interesting thing about this, is that after this was published, I was invited by the Long Island Community Council and the Hagedorn Foundation to talk to them because they were interested, what can we do about this? And one of the initiatives that was born out of that was, can you guess? Erase racism. Isn't that weird? Oh, Lord.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Long Island, Our Story. All right?
I still have that.
You still got this book?
Oh, yeah.
Heavy as a mother.
Yep.
All right, we did this over a year. And this was kind of interesting because we went out and we tried to find as much history about Long Island as we possibly could and pull it together. And I will say that we failed. There was a lot more that we didn't know, a lot more that we know now, but at least we tried. But I thought you might find this interesting. It's about Lincoln O. Lynch. Does anybody know who he is? Or he died a few years ago. 100 years after Abraham Lincoln freed the slave, a black man also named Lincoln walked into the podium at the Garden City Hotel. He was there on the first day of January 1963, the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, to receive an award for the NAACP. Lincoln O. Lynch, clean cut and conservatively dressed. Damn, I could write well. Now I write about politics now, I'm sorry. Carried several handwritten sheets of notebook paper and placed them gently on the stand. When the polite applause died down, the recently appointed chairman of the Long Island branch of the Congress of Racial Equity looked out over an audience of almost 1,000 people, most of them black Long Islanders, and began to speak. It was not what the audience expected. Here in Nassau County, Lynch began, and indeed in the very village of Garden City in which we now meet, racial discrimination and segregation cry out for correction. All over Nassau, from Inwood to Oyster Bay, from Glen Cove and Manhasset and Port Washington, on our supposedly fabulous North Shore, to Freeport and Farmingdale and Roosevelt, and across the border into Amityville, there exists shameless evidence of undisguised discrimination. He said this in 1963. When I interviewed him, he was 78 years old, and I asked him, dude, no, I didn't say dude, I said, what was the most successful achievement that you did with all of this? And he told me, we made people aware of conditions that existed and what they could do about it. No one else had dared to meet the situation head on. Okay? What was your least successful? Bringing more black students into the movement. He said, we made the mistake of educating white people on Long Island too much, rather than educating black students on how to be effective advocates. Lincoln Lynch, I was very happy to meet him. Then there was this little puppy. This is Nassau, what's next? You saw some statistics here, right? You see that Long Island is diversifying. And guess what? It's been diversifying for a long time. A long, long time. You know, I often think, people talk about a changing Long Island. The conversation needs to be different. It needs to be a changed Long Island. 1993. People say, holy cow, look who's moving in. said Ray Lopez, Hempstead Town's first Deputy Commissioner of Planning and Economic Development, who was also a member of the Nassau County Hispanic Association. We are going to be here and they're going to have to accept us. 1993. My job over the past 3.5 decades has been to be a witness. I wasn't born here. I wasn't raised here. I've been able to look at this with a dispassionate eye. In fact, I've even raised 2 Long Islanders. Neither of whom, by the way, has a Long Island accent. But time after time after time, what you see here, you see over and over and over again. We had a story about Glen Cove. There's a neighborhood in Glen Cove, a Latino neighborhood in Glen Cove. They want to know what redevelopment is going to mean for them. That neighborhood didn't exist 20 years ago. And let me fast forward very quickly, because it looks like nothing's changed. But I contend that something has. In the last election, people of color made a huge difference on Long Island. Andrew Cuomo would have lost the vote in Suffolk County for the 2nd election in a row, had it not been for black and brown people voting for him. The state legislature changed from Republican hands to Democratic hands. That would have been impossible without black and brown and Asian votes. One of the new senators is from East Meadow. He's Indian. And he got a big difference in the vote in the Bangladeshi community in East Meadow. Did you know there was a Bangladeshi community in East Meadow? Things are the same and things are changing. Sometimes I think when we talk about institutional racism, we really don't understand how strong institutions can be. We really don't understand how to move institutions forward. And that's actually the challenge that's put before us today. I can tell you that over 36 years, well, actually, let me give you one more. Why a Long Island without racism would be better for everyone? Right? Long Islanders spend a lot of time patting themselves on the back for keeping the island from, in the oft-repeated words of local politicians, becoming just like Queens. In acceptable Long Island think, what's Queen-like is urban and that's bad. Sorry, Queens guys. What's Long Island like is suburban and safe, relatively wealthy and white, and that's considered good. In the effort to keep things as they are, however, Long Islanders are strangling the region's only chance of maturing as an economic center and as a vibrant, viable region. They, and that we, are narrowing the possibility of keeping our own children on Long Island. We are bungling any opportunity to address some of the very real problems that vex Long Island. I wrote that on Newsday's editorial board, 2002. We're here now. I'm ready to hear from the other panelists, but I just wanted to kind of give you some sense. We don't have to go back to when the Indians first came to Long Island to talk about the history. Thank you.